The presence of sacred icons in our lives is not merely a visual aid for reflection. They are pathways that connect us to the divine. To touch an icon is not a casual or meaningless act, but rather a deeply significant gesture that speaks of our inner longing for God, our desire to bridge the gap between the earthly and the heavenly. When we approach an icon, we are not merely encountering an image, but entering into a relationship with the presence that it represents. This profound truth is often lost in the rush of daily life, where we may quickly pass by the icons in our homes or churches without truly reflecting on their significance. But if we allow ourselves to pause, to slow down, and to truly see, we begin to realize that these icons are not mere decorations, they are windows to heaven. Icons are not made to be idols. They are symbols of a reality that transcends the material world. In their sacred forms, they convey not only the likeness of Christ, the Virgin Mary, or the saints, but also a spiritual truth that touches the deepest parts of our souls. How often do we find ourselves hurriedly passing through the motions of prayer or worship without truly encountering God in the act? The touch of an icon should not be reduced to a mere ritual. It must come from a place of humility and reverence. For when we touch the icon, we are not simply making contact with the surface, but reaching out in faith to the very presence that the icon signifies. St. John of Damascus, one of the great defenders of the use of icons in the Church, understood this deeply. He once wrote, "We do not worship the image itself, but the reality it represents." In his writings, he emphasized that icons were not idols to be worshipped, but instruments through which the faithful could draw closer to the divine. He experienced the power of icons personally, recounting stories of visions and encounters with the saints through their sacred images. It was not the icon itself that had power, but the faith with which it was approached. St. John's words remind us that icons serve as reminders of God's presence among us, but it is our hearts, opened in humility and love, that allow us to experience the grace they convey. As we approach an icon, it is important to do so with a prayerful heart. The simple act of bowing or kissing the icon is not about outward show, but about aligning our hearts with God's will. One prayer that can be said in reverence before an icon is, "O Lord, through the intercession of your saints, grant me peace and clarity in my heart." This prayer acknowledges both the holiness of the icon and our need for God's grace in our lives. When we touch an icon, let it be an act of surrender to the divine presence it represents. Consider how many times we rush through our daily prayers, thinking of them as duties to check off a list. But do we truly stop to enter into the presence of God in those moments?
Do we take time to reflect on the meaning behind the words we speak? The touch of an icon invites us to pause, to reflect, and open our hearts to the sacred. This is why the act of veneration is not just a ritual, it is a form of prayer. In a world that often forgets to slow down and reflect, icons remind us of the importance of reverence, stillness, and communion with God. The Bible gives us guidance in this regard, although many people misunderstand the commandment about idols. In Exodus 24, we read, "You shall not make for yourselves a graven image, or any likeness of anything that is in the heaven above or on the earth below." This commandment is often misunderstood to mean that all images are forbidden, but this is not the case. In fact, the Church teaches that images used in worship are not idols, but are meant to direct our hearts to the living God. Icons are not objects to be worshipped in themselves, but they help us focus on God's presence, reminding us of the saints and of Christ Himself. So when we touch an icon, we must do so with understanding and reverence. The icon itself is not holy by its material composition, but because of what it represents. The simple wood and paint carry within them the power of God's grace, for they point us to the deeper spiritual truths of His presence and His action in the world. In touching an icon, we acknowledge that God is near to us, and in that moment, we are invited into a deeper relationship with Him. It is not just the physical touch that matters, but the spiritual posture we take before God. Each gesture before an icon, the bow, the kiss, the prayer, should come from a heart that is open to the presence of God. As we touch the icon, let it be a symbol of our desire to touch the divine, to encounter God in a personal and intimate way. When we approach the sacred, we are called to remember that every moment is an opportunity to draw closer to God, to open our hearts more fully to His love, and to be transformed by His presence. How often do we take these moments for granted, rushing through life without recognizing the sacredness that surrounds us? The icons in our homes and churches are not mere decorations. They are invitations to encounter God in a deeper way. By taking the time to reverently touch an icon, we enter into the mystery of the divine, and in doing so, we allow ourselves to be changed by His grace. May we all approach the sacred icons with the reverence and humility they deserve. Let us be mindful of the great gift they offer us, inviting us to encounter the living God in the simple yet profound act of touching His holy presence. When we consider the act of venerating icons, we must not forget that it is not merely a physical action, but a deeply spiritual one. The way we approach an icon speaks volumes about the disposition of our hearts. Do we come with reverence or with haste?
Are we prepared to enter into the sacred moment, or do we treat the icon as just another object in our busy world? The manner in which we touch the icon, the bow, the kiss, the prayer, reveals the state of our inner life. It is not the outward gesture alone that matters, but the intention behind it. The very act of touching an icon invites us to open our hearts in prayer, to quiet the noise of the world, and to stand before the divine in awe and humility. Consider the story of St. George, one of the great martyrs of the Church, whose life and death speak to the power of faith in the face of suffering. St. George, renowned for his courage in defending the Christian faith, was known to have a deep devotion to the holy icons. Before going into battle or facing any trial, he would pause to pray before an icon, asking for the strength to remain faithful to God, no matter the cost. One of the most profound moments of his life came when he was tortured for his faith, yet remained steadfast, refusing to renounce his beliefs. As he was being led to his death, he reportedly asked his captors for one final request: to be allowed to pray before an icon of Christ. This request was granted, and as he knelt before the icon, he found himself filled with divine strength, his fear overcome by the presence of God. It was in this sacred moment, standing before the image of Christ, that he found the courage to face his death with peace and joy. His devotion to the icons was not simply a cultural practice, but a deep and personal way of connecting with the living God. St. George's story reminds us that icons are not only images of the past, but they are also bridges to the present. Through them, we are invited to connect with the saints, with Christ Himself, and to receive the strength and grace we need to face the challenges of our own lives. The icon is not a passive object. It is a living connection to the divine. Just as St. George drew strength from his moments of prayer before the icon, we too are called to approach the icons with the same openness and faith. It is in these moments that we allow ourselves to be shaped and transformed by the grace they convey. In the same way, we are called to approach the icons with a prayerful heart.
A simple but profound prayer to say before an icon might be, "O Lord, grant me the strength to walk in your ways and the wisdom to discern your will. Through the intercession of your saints, may I find peace and courage." This prayer, humble and direct, acknowledges both the sacredness of the icon and our need for God's guidance and grace. It is a reminder that in the act of touching an icon, we are not simply performing a ritual, but opening ourselves to a deeper encounter with the divine. As we stand before an icon, let us ask ourselves, do we come with expectation? Do we approach the sacred with the awareness that God desires to meet us in that moment?
The touch of the icon is not just a gesture. It is an invitation to be present, to be still, and to listen. In our modern world, filled with distractions and noise, it can be easy to forget the power of stillness and reflection. But it is in these moments of quiet reverence that we encounter the presence of God. In the act of touching an icon, we remind ourselves that our lives are not mere busyness, but are meant to be lived in communion with the divine. The Bible, too, speaks to the importance of sacred images and the role they play in our spiritual lives. In the Old Testament, we are reminded of the significance of the tabernacle and the Ark of the Covenant, which contains sacred objects that were revered by the Israelites. While God forbids the worship of idols, He commands the creation of sacred images to remind the people of His presence among them. The use of these sacred images was never about idol worship, but about creating a means of connecting with God in the midst of their daily lives. "And you shall make a mercy seat of pure gold, and there I will meet with you." Exodus 25:17-22. The presence of these holy objects, including the mercy seat in the Ark of the Covenant, was not about the objects themselves, but about the encounter with God they facilitated. Just as the Israelites encountered God through these sacred objects, so too do we encounter God through the icons in our lives. They are not idols, but instruments that guide our hearts and minds toward the divine. The icons remind us that we are not alone. God is with us, speaking to us through these sacred images. As we touch the icon, let us be mindful of the power of this moment. We are not merely touching a piece of wood or paint, but connecting with the reality it represents. We are invited to step into a moment of prayer and reverence, to pause from our busy lives and reflect on the divine presence that is always with us. It is not enough to simply perform the outward act. We must also open our hearts, inviting the grace of God to transform us. In our daily lives, it is so easy to forget the presence of the divine. We become consumed with our tasks, our worries, and our distractions. But when we pause to touch an icon, we are reminded that God is always near. The act of reverence is not just a formality, it is an opportunity to draw near to God, to open our hearts to His presence, and to receive the strength we need for the day ahead. How often do we take these sacred moments for granted, rushing through them without truly reflecting on their significance? The icons in our homes and churches are not just beautiful works of art. They are sacred channels through which we encountered the divine. May we approach them with reverence and humility, allowing each touch to bring us closer to the presence of God. The power of icons lies not only in the images themselves, but in the way they invite us into a deeper relationship with God.
As we approach them in prayer, we must remember that the icon is not an object to be idolized, but a holy doorway to divine truth. It is through our prayerful touch, our words of devotion, and our contemplation of the sacred image that we are drawn into the presence of God. One of the simplest yet most profound practices in our veneration of icons is the act of prayer before them.
A prayer before an icon can be as simple as saying, "O Lord, through the intercession of your saints, grant me peace and strength to live according to your will." This prayer, spoken with sincerity and devotion, is a reminder that the icon represents more than just an image. It is a representation of the holy presence of God, who is always near, always ready to hear the cries of our hearts. When we pray before an icon, we are not merely repeating words. We are opening our hearts, creating space for God to come into our lives in a new and profound way. Saint Seraphim of Sarov, one of the most beloved saints in the Russian Orthodox Church, was known for his deep love of icons. He would often be found praying before them for hours, gazing into their holy images with such intensity that it seemed as though he was communing directly with the saints and Christ himself. He taught that through prayer and veneration of icons, we are not only connecting with the saints depicted, but we are also being drawn closer to Christ himself. Saint Seraphim's life was marked by an intense personal devotion, and he understood the power of icons in deepening one's relationship with God. His story serves as a reminder that our practice of veneration is not a mere formality. It is a means by which we open ourselves to the transformative grace of God. Icons also serve as a tool for cultivating inner peace. In the stillness of prayer before an icon, we are given the opportunity to quiet our minds and hearts, to leave behind the distractions of the world, and to focus solely on the presence of God. The act of standing before an icon and offering a prayer can become a sacred moment in our day, a time when we pause to reflect on the divine and allow our spirits to be refreshed. One of the most beautiful prayers that can be said before an icon is the prayer of Saint Ephrem the Syrian. "O Lord and Master of my life, take from me the spirit of sloth, despair, lust of power, and idle talk, but give rather the spirit of chastity, humility, patience, and love to your servant. Yea, O Lord and King, grant me to see my own transgressions and not to judge my brother, for you are blessed unto the ages of ages." This prayer, filled with humility and supplication, captures the essence of what it means to approach an icon with reverence and openness to God's transforming grace. As we pray before an icon, we are invited to reflect on our own lives, to ask for forgiveness for our shortcomings, and to seek the strength to live more fully in accordance with God's will.
In the Bible, we see the importance of sacred objects in helping the people of God encounter His presence. In the Old Testament, God commanded the Israelites to build the tabernacle, a portable place of worship that contained sacred objects, including the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark was a symbol of God's presence among His people, and it was treated with the utmost reverence. The Bible tells us that whenever the Ark moved, the people would stop and bow, recognizing that they were in the presence of the Lord. "Ye shall make a mercy seat of pure gold, and there I will make with you." Exodus 25:17-22. Just as the Ark served as a place of encounter with God in the Old Testament, so too do the icons serve as a sacred meeting place for us today. When we touch an icon, we are not merely touching an object, we are reaching out to God in faith. The act of veneration is a means of acknowledging God's presence in our lives, of recognizing that He is always near, always ready to hear our prayers. In the stillness of prayer before the icon, we are invited to enter into the mystery of God's love, to open ourselves to His grace, and to be transformed by His presence. It is important to remember that prayer before an icon should not be rushed or performed out of habit. Instead, it should be a deliberate act of devotion, a moment when we pause and give our full attention to the presence of God. The icon is not just a picture, it is a reflection of the eternal truth of God's love for us. In the quiet of prayer, we are invited to allow that truth to sink deep into our hearts,
to be renewed by the grace that flows from the image of the holy. In our busy lives, it is easy to overlook the power of these sacred moments. We may think that we have no time to stop and pray before an icon, that we are too busy with the demands of daily life. But in reality, it is in these moments of stillness and reverence that we encounter the peace of God. Just as Saint Seraphim of Sarov found strength and peace in his time spent in prayer before the icons, so too can we find solace and renewal in the quiet moments of devotion. How often do we forget that God is always present, always ready to meet us in our moments of prayer? How often do we treat the sacred moments of our lives as mere tasks to be completed, rather than opportunities for encounter with the divine? When we approach an icon, we are not simply performing a ritual, we are opening ourselves to God's transforming grace. And it is in these moments that we are truly made whole. In the midst of our busy lives, let us not forget the power of prayer before the icons. Let each touch of the icon be a reminder of God's love, each prayer a step toward greater communion with Him. Let us approach these sacred images not as objects of decoration, but as living connections to the divine presence, always ready to lead us deeper into the mystery of God's love and grace.
May we find peace in these moments, and may they lead us into a deeper, more intimate relationship with our Creator. In the holy tradition of the Church, we are given a deeper understanding of the role that sacred images play in our journey toward God. Icons are not simply decorations, they are holy mirrors reflecting the divine presence. Through them, we are reminded that God is not distant or removed from our lives, but intimately present, accessible, and engaged in our daily existence. But how then do we understand the biblical perspective on sacred images, especially when we encounter passages that seem to warn against the use of images? In Exodus 24, God commands, "Ye shall not make for yourselves a graven image, or any likeness of anything that is in the heaven above, or on the earth below, or in the waters beneath the earth." These words are often quoted by those who misunderstand the role of icons in the Christian faith. But when we examine the full context, we see that God is not prohibiting the creation of all images. Rather, He is cautioning against the creation of idols, objects that are worshipped as gods. The prohibition is not against images themselves, but against the idolatrous worship of images. In fact, the Bible is full of sacred images that were not only permitted, but also commanded by God. The Ark of the Covenant, the tabernacle, and the bronze serpent were all sacred objects, and their purpose was to lead the people to a deeper relationship with God, not to replace Him. When we approach an icon, we must remember that it is not an idol to be worshipped in itself, but a window through which we are invited into the divine. The icon itself holds no power. It is merely a medium through which God's presence is made tangible. Just as the Israelites revered the ark and the tabernacle as symbols of God's dwelling among them, so too do we venerate icons as symbols that point us to the true presence of God.
The honor we give to the icon is not to the material object itself, but to the holy figure it represents. St. John's words invite us to look beyond the material world and to see the spiritual reality that the icon reveals. Through the icon, we are invited into the mystery of the divine presence. When we touch an icon, we are not simply touching wood or paint, but we are reaching out in faith to the reality it represents. The act of touching the icon is a way of acknowledging that God is not distant, but that He is near. The icon reminds us that we are not alone in our struggles, that the saints who are depicted in the image are interceding for us, and that Christ is always present to guide us. In the act of veneration, we are invited to align our hearts with the divine, to open ourselves to the grace that is freely given. One of the most profound practices of the Church is the veneration of icons during prayer. As we approach an icon, we are called to offer our hearts to God, to invite His presence into our lives. A simple but powerful prayer that can be said before an icon is, "O Lord, through the intercession of your saints, grant me peace, clarity, and the strength to follow your will." This prayer, though simple, contains all that we need: a plea for God's peace, a desire for clarity in our lives, and a commitment to live according to His will. It is a prayer that acknowledges the presence of God through the icon and opens our hearts to His transforming grace. But what does this practice truly mean in our lives? How can we ensure that our veneration of icons is not just an empty ritual, but a means of drawing closer to God? The answer lies in our willingness to approach the icon with reverence and humility. The icon is not simply an object to be touched, but it is a mirror that reflects the divine truth. When we touch an icon, we are invited to reflect on the reality it represents. Do we come before God with an open heart, or do we rush through the act of veneration without allowing it to penetrate our souls? The icon calls us to a deeper level of prayer, a prayer that acknowledges God's presence in every moment of our lives. As we reflect on the role of sacred images, we must ask ourselves, how often do we fail to recognize the presence of God in our daily lives? How often do we become distracted by the busyness of the world, neglecting the quiet moments of prayer and reflection that bring us closer to God? The icon, in all its beauty and holiness, serves as a reminder that God is always near. It calls us to slow down, to pause, and to recognize His presence in our lives. The use of sacred images, then, is not a mere cultural practice or religious tradition. It is a means of drawing near to the divine. Icons are not idols, but instruments through which we encounter God. They are not objects of worship in themselves, but mirrors reflecting the eternal truth of God's love and grace.
As we approach the icon in prayer, let us do so with reverence and humility, knowing that in doing so, we are entering into the presence of the living God. May our hearts be open, our prayers sincere, and our lives transformed by the grace that flows from the sacred images before us. As we conclude our reflection on the proper veneration of sacred icons, we are reminded that the true power of icons lies not in their physicality, but in their ability to bring us into the presence of God. The act of reverence, whether through bowing, kissing, or standing in prayer before the icon, is a spiritual act that has the potential to transform our hearts and our lives. It is through this encounter that we are invited to experience the grace of God in a deeply personal and intimate way. Icons, in their profound simplicity, become more than just objects. They become vessels of divine grace, allowing us to step into the eternal mystery of God's love. The Church teaches that the proper veneration of icons is not merely an outward formality, but a way of engaging with the divine. Saint Basil the Great, one of the great early Church fathers, spoke of the need to approach sacred images with humility and reverence. He wrote, "When we approach the icon, we do not just gaze upon it. We step into it, allowing it to bring us closer to the reality it represents." The act of reverence, whether through bowing, kissing, or standing in prayer before the icon, is a spiritual act that has the potential to transform our hearts and our lives. It is through this encounter that we are invited to experience the grace of God in a deeply personal and intimate way. Icons, in their profound simplicity, become more than just objects.
They become vessels of divine grace, allowing us to step into the eternal mystery of God's love. The Church teaches that the proper veneration of icons is not merely an outward formality, but a way of engaging with the divine. Saint Basil the Great, one of the great early Church Fathers, spoke of the need to approach sacred images with humility and reverence. He wrote, "When we approach the icon, we do not just gaze upon it, we step into it, allowing it to bring us closer to the reality it represents." The act of reverence is an invitation to enter into a deeper relationship with the holy figures depicted in the icon, and ultimately with Christ himself. In the act of prayer before an icon, we do not merely honor the image itself, but we honor the truth it reveals. We are invited to contemplate the life and virtues of the saints, to reflect on the presence of Christ in our lives, and to open our hearts to the transformative power of divine grace. A simple prayer to say before an icon might be, "O Lord, I humbly bow before this image, seeking your presence in my life. Through the intercession of your saints, grant me the grace to follow in their footsteps and to live according to your will." This prayer, humble and direct, invites us to align our hearts with the divine and to surrender our lives to the guidance of God. Throughout the centuries, saints have shared their own experiences of the power of icons to transform the soul. One such saint is Saint Nicholas of Myra, a beloved bishop who is known for his deep compassion and love for those in need. Saint Nicholas's life was marked by a profound devotion to prayer, and he often prayed before icons, seeking guidance and strength in his ministry. There is a story of Saint Nicholas that speaks to the power of icons to bring healing and comfort. During a time of great trial in his life, when he was imprisoned for his faith, he was granted a vision of Christ through an icon. In this vision, Christ extended his hand to Saint Nicholas and offered him comfort, reminding him that his suffering was not in vain.
Nicholas's encounter with Christ through the icon was a moment of profound peace and strength, and it became a source of inspiration for his ministry in the years to come. The story of St. Nicholas reminds us that the proper veneration of icons can provide us with the strength we need to face the challenges of our lives. Just as St. Nicholas found solace in his prayer before the icon, so too can we find comfort in our own moments of prayer and reflection before the sacred images that adorn our homes and churches. The icons are not just pictures, they are windows into the divine, offering us the opportunity to encounter God in a deeply personal way. In moments of sorrow, doubt, or struggle, the act of prayer before an icon can provide us with the peace and strength we need to persevere. One of the most beautiful aspects of the veneration of icons is that it is not confined to a particular place or time. Icons can be found in our homes, our churches, and even in our hearts. They are reminders of God's presence, always available to us, regardless of where we are or what we are doing. In our busy lives, it can be easy to forget that God is always near, but when we pause to venerate an icon, we are reminded that He is with us, that He is always present, always ready to meet us in our time of need. The touch of an icon, the simple act of bowing before it, becomes a way of drawing near to God, of acknowledging His presence in our lives, and of opening our hearts to His grace. The Bible itself offers us examples of the power of sacred images in our relationship with God. In the Old Testament, we are told of the importance of the Ark of the Covenant, a sacred object that was revered by the Israelites as a sign of God's presence among them. The Ark contained the tablets of the law, and it was treated with the utmost reverence. In 2 Samuel 6, 2-6, we see King David's joyful procession as he brings the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. And David arose and went with all the people who were with him from Baale-Judah to bring up from there the Ark of God, which is called by the very name of the Lord of hosts, who is enthroned on the cherubim. The ark was not just a physical object. It was a symbol of God's dwelling among His people, a reminder of His presence in their midst. The reverence shown to the ark by King David and the people of Israel is a reflection of the way in which we are called to approach sacred images in our own lives. In the New Testament, we see how the sacred images of Christ and the saints help us to grow in faith and in our relationship with God. Christ Himself often used physical objects to teach spiritual truths, whether it was the bread and wine at the Last Supper, the healing touch of His hands, or the simple act of sitting with His disciples. These physical acts were always meant to point beyond themselves to the deeper spiritual reality they represent.
In the same way, the icons are meant to draw our attention to the eternal truths of God's love, mercy, and grace. When we venerate an icon, we are not worshiping the image itself, but we are entering into the mystery of the divine, allowing it to transform our hearts and our lives. As we reflect on the power of icons, we are reminded that the act of veneration is not just a ritual, but a means of drawing near to God. It is an invitation to open our hearts to the grace that flows from these sacred images, and to allow that grace to shape our lives. The icons are not just pictures, they are pathways to the divine. And through them, we are invited into the eternal mystery of God's love. May we approach them with reverence and humility, and may our hearts be transformed by the grace that flows from the divine presence they represent.